Hi folks, thanks for joining me today on the first in our Screens and Scrolls series. Screens and Scrolls, Scrolls and Screens. And on this part of the channel, I'm going to be looking at books, movies and TV programs associated with wargaming. And I thought what better way to start than to look at some of the works of the three men most responsible for the UK wargaming scene. And they are, of course, Donald Featherstone, Charles Grant and Terence Wise. So we'll start with Donald Featherstone because he's generally regarded as the father of British wargaming. He was born in London in 1918 and at the age of 12 he found a copy of H.G. Wells's Little Wars in his local library, and it was this that sparked his interest in wargaming. During the Second World War he saw active service with the Royal Armoured Corps. He served in North Africa, and he later wrote a book about his experiences there called Lost Tales. After the war, he became a physiotherapist, and he was actually the physio for Southampton Football Club. And it was while living in Southampton that he got permission from his wife to convert one of the back rooms downstairs into a permanent gaming room. And this room became a sort of hub, or I guess a ground zero, if you like, for wargaming in the UK, because from there Donald started the UK's first War Games magazine, the War Games newsletter. Of course, he was running regular games at the house. He set up the UK's first War Games convention at his house, and he also wrote the first of his many books there as well. This was all sort of early 60s, 62, 63, around that sort of time. Donald was active in wargaming well into his retirement, and he passed away in 2013. In fact, there was quite a poignant remark from someone on one of the obituaries that says, even Don gets to roll a 00 at some point. So really a major figure in UK wargaming, a pivotal figure. And I thought, well, I've actually got two books that we're going to look at of his. This one was from the 80s, Featherstone's Complete Wargaming, and this was something that certainly caught my eye back in the day. Although by this time I'd moved a little more into role-playing games, I still had an interest in tabletop, so when I saw this I snapped it up. And then about a year ago I found this in a second-hand bookshop, Naval War Games. This is a much older book covering naval war games from all periods of history. Here's our first book then, Featherstone's Complete Wargaming. Hardback book, a nice size. And the first thing I noticed when I opened this up was the price. It's $14.95, which is a fair old whack back in the 80s. And I just wanted to check when this one was published. So, oh, it's actually 1988, so a lot later than I thought. Yeah, quite a bit later. In my mind, this was sort of early to mid 80s. Anyway, this isn't really a set of rules as such, though there are suggestions for rules in it. But he basically goes it through how you get into wargaming. So how you choose your period, how you paint models up, and some ideas for battles and scenarios based on actual events. There's a lot of really nice colour plates throughout, colour and black and white. There's a lovely photo here from 1975. That's in London, the 165th anniversary Battle of Waterloo, fought in a London hotel. And as you can see, back then wargaming used to attract quite a crowd of people. I think it really was the first sort of boom time for war games, the late 60s into the 70s. And then we get into the first ideas on which period you might like to choose. So this is all details about the American Civil War. It talks about the history, the weapons, and gives you advice on units and figures. And then we get into some actual rules. So like I said, these are not really presented as a set of rules, but there are lots of suggestions for rules throughout relative to whichever period is being discussed, of course. And throughout the book we get these little sections as well. down at the War Games Club. There's a few of these throughout, and they're sort of light-hearted little reminiscences of things that might or might not have happened at the Wargaming Club. Again, usually relating to the era that he's talking about in that particular chapter. So this is about someone who chose the 95th Rifles because his dad had been a soldier in that unit, and so on and so on. Yeah, they're quite amusing. One or two of them do show their age in places. But anyway, then we get into tanks, and I think, as he says here, the pure war, tanks in the desert. I think someone said it was like a tactician's dream and a logistics nightmare, because the war in North Africa, as far as tanks go, it was almost like naval, just these huge open spaces. But of course, aspects of the terrain and the weather and everything else made supply an absolute nightmare. And one chapter I particularly liked was how about refighting the first battle of all time, which takes us back to the Egyptians, Pharaoh Thothmes III, 1500 BC. And there, of course, we're into our chariots and everything else. Not a period I've ever really gained in, but that does pique my interest. And right at the end of the book, that's another quite historical one. I think that's Tony Bath, Charles Grant there. And that just says, down at the War Games Club, a battle in progress. All looks very formal, doesn't it? Everyone's wearing jacket and ties. You don't see that sort of thing these days. My house standards have slipped. So, there we go. That was late 80s, Donald Featherstone. Excellent book. Excellent guide for anyone who wanted to get into wargaming. And even if you are into it, there's a lot of good information in there. So here's that second Featherstone book I wanted to look at, Naval War Games. Fighting sea battles with model ships. Because now this is an old one. This goes back to 1973, and it's actually from Northamptonshire County Library. Now, I didn't pinch it because it is one of those discarded books, and I picked this up. I think it might have been in Oxfam or possibly a second-hand bookshop in Cambridge. Anyway, 1973, it is showing its age a little bit, and this is coverage and rules for fighting model ship battles from the main eras. So we go back to ancient period, we've got Spanish Armada, mid-18th century, Napoleonic, American Civil War, late 19th century, early 20th century, and World War I and II. So quite a lot of periods covered. We do get some very nice black and white pictures in the middle. That's American Wargamers, the Cumberland Military Miniatures Society. This is looking at some of the naval games that were available at the time. I mean, who hasn't played battleships, right? There's one called Buccaneer. I don't remember that. We did have a game called Admiral that was a setup where you each had these little sort of wooden blocks facing each other. And I suppose it was a little bit like a chess kind of thing. You had to try and take the flagship of the Admiral. Anyone else out there remember that? We used to play that a lot as kids. And then we get into our actual models. Now, at the time, I can't imagine there was a lot about, but we've got these 1/1200 Triang miniatures. So another option back then was to make your own ships. We've got some home cast flat ships there. So as I say, there's very usable rules in here, very detailed in some cases. I think in the Second World War section, it gives a formula for working out sort of fighting values of ships. And it's the tonnage times the guns divided by etc, etc. It really is quite mathematical. But, you could take these rules out of this book and use them. In fact, some of the naval games I've done on a Monday with Pete and Steve, we've done sort of Russo-Japanese War. Some of the rules are very close to this kind of stuff. So I guess a set of good rules is a set of good rules whenever they were written. And of course you can't talk about naval wargaming without talking about Jane, Fred Jane, who wrote all those Jane's reference books I'm sure you've seen. And there's also the history of the Fletcher Pratt famous naval war games as well, which used to be played on the floor. And apparently these games ended up, like they started with a couple of guys, in a house, and ended up hiring ballrooms and having like 20 players a side. Quite amazing, very interesting stuff. Again, some really good wargaming history in there. So, there we go. There's that chart I mentioned. Now, what do you think of that? I was never much good at maths anyway, but that just fries my brain. Anyway, if you're into naval wargaming and you see that in a second-hand bookshop somewhere, then well worth getting a copy. The second author we're going to look at is Charles Grant. Again, another person who was there at the beginning of the modern UK wargaming scene. Now, Charles Grant was born in Scotland. He served with the RAF during World War II, and post-war he actually served with Special Branch at Scotland Yard. Between 1968 and 1970, Charles wrote a series of 32 articles for Meccano magazine, and these articles were later brought together and published in this book called Battle, which is basically a set of rules for tabletop World War II wargaming. Charles Grant passed away in 1979, but his work was continued by his son, Charles S. Grant, who authored a lot of books and continues to be a major influence on the UK wargaming scene. So here's our Charles Grant book, Battle, Practical Wargaming. And this was published by MAP, Model and Allied Publications. They used to put a lot of stuff out at the time, I remember. A lot of modelling books on all different subjects, and of course some wargaming books as well. £1.25. I didn't buy this at the time. I actually got this copy on eBay. It wasn't a book I'd ever seen, so I wanted to get a copy just to check it out. That was a couple of years ago. So yeah, 1970, although this was reprinted in 1972. And this, unlike the previous book, this is purely a set of rules for World War II wargaming. So we start with introduction. Nice picture of a layout there. It's interesting. I've mentioned before on some other things about, you know, to some extent models have improved, certainly castings have improved, and I guess materials with plastics and resin, but that wouldn't look out of place on a Monday night or at any War Games convention, you know. So although there have been some refinements, a lot of things stay the same. And we're straight into some mechanics that I guess to my generation of war gamers, this is a sort of bread and butter. This is the sort of thing we came up on. So with 20mm scale, each turn equals a minute, 1 inch equals 100 yards, and that kind of detail was the foundation for a lot of games back then. And maybe to some extent still is, although I don't so much see in modern rules that idea of ground scale or time scale particularly. We start off with infantry weapons, we go through to artillery, and then we get into anti-tank guns, and sort of about halfway in you get this armoured action, which is a nice playthrough of a simple scenario. So really that's a nice way of taking you through the rules by showing you a game in progress. And again, I remember all this old type of scenery, Bologna, rivers and hills. Your trees were probably from a model railway manufacturer like maybe Triangle or something. I'm always a sucker for a map. So yeah, and again, these are a reasonably detailed set of rules, and again, some of the Second World War games I played recently are really not too different from this, particularly with this kind of thing. I think this is something that Grant came up with. So you've got a few play aids in the game. One is this sort of cone of fire for machine guns, submachine guns. There are things like a protractor on a stick. He doesn't use tape measures so much, he more uses measuring sticks, which is something that a lot of people still use. And when you make a hit on a tank, you put the measuring stick against it and a protractor to determine the angle. And of course, if you're hitting at 90 degrees, then that's all well and good. But as the angle starts to change, then that reduces your chance. There's an artillery grid as well, which you make out of some wooden dowel. There we go, shell burst indicator device. And again, we were using one of these just a few weeks ago in the Second World War game. So that just plots where your artillery shells fall. They might go short, they might go long, they might deviate a little bit. So a lot of stuff in here that became standard for games we still play today. Now, I think I'm right in saying that this book was reissued in 2017. So it was this original work with some added chapters that were either not printed at the time or weren't included in the original book.
and I believe there may have been a sort of rules booklet with it as well. But I've not seen that. If anyone has a copy, I'd be very interested to hear how it has changed, if they changed any of the rules at all is it as it's presented here.
So the final author we're going to look at today is Terence Wise. He was born in 1936, same year as my dad. I'm not sure if he was born in Doncaster, but he certainly lived in Doncaster for most of his life. I believe he had a shop there as well at one time. Now, he served for 3 years in the 17th 21st Lancers as a gunner in Centurion tanks, and after that he also spent 3 years in the Merchant Navy. He got into wargaming but was playing with flat figures for a long time. For those of you who haven't seen those, they're basically like a two-dimensional figure, like a cardboard cutout if you like, that's put on bases. But in the late 60s, his nephew introduced him to airfix figures. Just after that, he discovered the books War Games and, once again, H.G. Wells's Little Wars, which crops up a lot. Of course, that's one of the pivotal wargaming books, which maybe we'll look at in a future episode. So he started wargaming with airfix figures. He was also very well known for converting airfix figures as well. And after a few years, he produced his first book, Introduction to Battle Gaming, which was the first wargaming book I read as well and bought this very copy, as I've mentioned before. So the Introduction to Battle Gaming was one of many books that Terence wrote. He was a very prolific author on military history. Osprey published a lot of his titles, a very knowledgeable man. He retired to Wales in his later years and passed away in 2010. And judging by the huge amount of obituaries you can find for him, I think that's another figure who had a huge influence on wargaming in the UK.
So Introduction to Battle Gaming by Terence Wise, which was my introduction to battle gaming. I suspect it was for many people. Again, that's another one printed by Map, and again that's £1.25. That was obviously a common price for books back at that time. Originally published in 1969, this reprint is 1972, so I probably would have got this maybe 73, 74, something like that. And I've gone through this before in one of my other films, so I'll just briefly describe it again. It basically gives you the history of wargaming, big mention of H.G. Wells of course, looks at choosing an era, how to create scenery and terrain, organise your army and so on. And rules wise, it gives you some basic but very workable rules for ancient warfare, also musket and Second World War. It then goes on to talk about some variations, some ideas, even how to make your own model soldiers. Did anyone try that back in the day? That must have been quite a thing. And at the back there's some details on figures and accessories, publications, societies and clubs, and so on. So basically all you needed to get into wargaming. And of course we mentioned Terry Wise and Airfix. Most of the figures in this, certainly the gaming ones, are Airfix. And of course, as I mentioned before, he was very well known for doing conversions on Airfix figures. Something he used to detail a lot. I think he had columns in Battle magazine, that was a wargaming magazine in the 70s, and in military modelling. I think he had a regular column in military modelling as well. So of course, this is very nice as well, you know, how you can make, again, if space is limited, you can have a nice map like this that actually doubles as a wargaming table. So you can turn that over and put it on your dining room table. How to make fields and hills, all that kind of stuff. And then you're into your actual rules. And again, one of the things that attracted me back in the day was this type of map. I always enjoyed looking at maps as a kid for some reason. The Second World War scenario is got in here. Let me just find the map for that. There we go. Bratwurst Village. I actually saw this in a wargaming magazine fairly recently. Someone did a replay of it using these original rules. I'll see if I can dig that out sometime. And the report was that, yeah, it was a very good game. And these rules, though they're, you know, reasonably basic, still stand up today. So there we are. So that's my first wargaming book ever bought. So that is the sort of treasured possession. Though you wouldn't think it to look at the state of that, would you? But, you know, it's a little bit like the action figures, isn't it? Action figures and all this kind of stuff is designed to be played with, designed to be used. Yet a lot of collectors will buy something and keep it in the box and put it in the cupboard. Me, I prefer to get use out of stuff, and that book certainly has had a lot of use.
So that concludes our look at three of what you might call the founding fathers of UK wargaming. Of course, there are a lot of other people we could mention as well. Eric Knowles, I mentioned before in relation to the new Model Army shop in Manor Park. Tony Bath, Brigadier Peter Young, then a little later there's people like Bruce Quarry, Stuart Asquith, all of whom contributed to the thriving wargaming scene that we enjoy today. But certainly when it comes to those three, I can't think that there's any wargamers of my generation or even younger generations who haven't got a copy of at least one book by those authors. Hope you've enjoyed our chat today. As always, please like, share and subscribe. And do let me know in the comments below, what is your favourite wargaming book? What was the most influential for you? What, if you had to grab one book in a house fire, which one would it be? Do let me know, I'll be very interested to hear. And if you have any personal reminiscences about any of those gentlemen, that also would be very interesting to hear as well. See you next time.